Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids. Wealthy kids, black kids.
Well, I'm not going to get into what I know or what I don't know. Here's what I know.
Just want to acknowledge that we're recording this on the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. Apologies for the recording quality of this episode. We had an opportunity to grab Judy on the way through town, and the normal production standard will resume. Thanks very much, and hope you enjoy.
It's Marbo, it's justice, it's law, it's the vibe, and no, that's it, it's the vibe.
Hi everyone, welcome to the latest episode of The Lever. I'm your host Luke, and very lucky we all are to have Judy down from the Byron Shire with us. Hello Judy.
Hi, how you going?
Good, thank you. Do you want to be just first name Judy, like a lot of our guests are? You don't want to fully out yourself?
Second name.
Do you want to you're putting a persona out there? You want to be...
Oh, I'll just mention my name is Judy Shelley. I have my own radio program called Multicultural Nation. It's on BFM 99.9 every Tuesday, 1 till 2, and you can listen to me. It's live streaming, but I'm only on once a month because I share the show with a lot of other multicultural voices.
Your show, which I've been a guest on, and you've inspired me. In fact, I don't think I would have this podcast if I hadn't met you.
Oh, really?
And yes,
That's awesome.
Or if you like encouraged me on to share my project that I was doing on Multicultural Nation, and because we were looking for diverse voices, so we've talked so much about like being white people who were very committed to diverse voices, and what can we do to be good allies, and your family's like so caught up with like multicultural stuff, so yeah, that's been a real project.
My children are non-white, so
Indeed.
it is a multicultural family.
Yes.
Directly.
And it sounds like most of your adult life has been, well, you know what it is to be a cultural other in another country and just living and doing your thing, right?
Yeah, and I think growing up in Sydney, it was just part of my life to be excited by other cultures, always. So, when I was growing up, I always had, friends of other backgrounds. It's just a normal part of life. But then when I left home and started working, I ended up in a community centre that was right in the middle of Cleveland Street, Sydney, which is Little Lebanon.
Yeah.
And so, I worked in a multicultural centre. And to me, it was always just fun and exciting and just a nice place to be around interesting cultures, interesting people, languages. It's just like normal Sydney life for me.
Yeah.
And then when I came to Byron Shire, it's a lot whiter, and it was, an atmosphere where I didn't feel that multiculturalism was recognised or acknowledged or celebrated as much as I'd like it to be. So I started to create activities that celebrated multiculturalism in every way. And
including
also
festival?
Indonesian culture, because my children are Indonesian and my partner at the time was Indonesian, so we became very involved in promoting Indonesian culture. Because when I went to live in Indonesia, I found that I was ashamed to be Australian because we then and until now still very ignorant about our neighbours.
Was it the imperialism?
Our neighbours. It's just really more the Eurocentric attitude of most Australians, because I lived in Indonesia as a family member, as an artist. I was very involved in the art community there. And so I was aware that people from Indonesia were travelling everywhere else across the planet, being highly respected and celebrated in Japan, Canada, America, Europe, Holland, and not Australia. Never. Until now, it's very little awareness about Indonesian culture initially. So I made a commitment to my Indonesian family and friends that when I came back to Australia, I just felt so grateful for everything they'd done for me as an artist. I wanted to give back by celebrating their culture and promoting it here, because I was very ashamed.
And very nice of you to let me come in and be part of interviewing Eka, is it Kurniawan?
Yeah, Eka Kurniawan. He's the most famous Indonesian writer at this time.
Yeah. What do they call? They marketed him as like the Gabriel Garcia Marquez of Indonesian
today,
fiction, but in Indonesia, I remember him saying that No one knows that he is so well known and celebrated outside of Indonesia. Is that that's political? Is it?
No, it's more just because the culture of Indonesia was more based in traditional art forms like wayang kulit, storytelling, dance, music, but writing was never so much an important aspect of culture. I mean, of course, there's a lot of really wonderful writers in Indonesia today, but it's sort of contemporary, whereas traditional art forms go back thousands of years, and that's what people experience on the daily in their lives is more to do with music, culture, things like that, because
participatory community.
A lot of people traditionally were non-literate as well, so it's storytelling and sharing through, more listening, watching performances, and that's very political as well in Indonesia.
But I remember him saying something like, if they knew how famous and influential he was outside, they would probably try to censor him. But they just didn't know through sort of ignorance, like, because he has a very sort of post-colonial critique and a very specific, like very strong political stance. So yeah, if you want to check out, now I'm going to pronounce it wrong again, Eka Kurniawan. And he has these amazing like magic realist titles and core like central engines of his novels. Hey,
well, censorship hasn't been so much the thing in this era, but still, in some ways, the political situation in Indonesia is complex. Because I really like to
There's layers of revolution and stuff, isn't there?
Correct. So I'm really wanting people to understand that since the fall of Suharto, or when Suharto stepped down in 1998, Indonesia has had a much freer press than we have here in Australia today.
Really?
And people do not know or understand that basically they don't know anything about what's happening in Indonesia.
Yeah.
But what happened in that time was, the whole of the dictatorship, the censorship, which was extreme prior to that time, was washed away.
Yes.
And a totally new system came into place, which gave really huge freedom of the press. So when he said that, sure, there's reactionary forces there that could come out against him, but whether that would be the actual government, I'm not sure.
Yes, because there's
a lot of reactionary,
yes,
parties and movements within the country that can attack you or attack things or people or situations, but it may not necessarily be the government. But prior to 1998, it was the government itself that censored every single thing, but that's not the case today in Indonesia.
My friend's father-in-law was a student protester in the 70s who went to jail, who, upon release, instantly went straight into the parliament and has been in the parliament ever since. So,
which was after
the
change of that government. See, when Suharto stepped down, many Indonesian activists returned to live in Indonesia. They hadn't even, they'd left Indonesia for decades.
Yeah.
But when he actually stepped down, as a result of the massive 1 million people protesting and protesters being shot and, extreme fear of there being a civil war, and he finally stepped down, the whole situation just was totally reversed and changed, and people just returned to Indonesia and started living a more open and free life there, activists that could never have lived under that regime. So that's something I, feel it's interesting this just come up, because a lot of people just basically don't really know much about Indonesia.
Well,
today in Australia.
I was going to ask, do you think that kind of historical regional ignorance that Australians have, I've seen a lot of talk about repression and censorship, and we've had two prime ministers sort of clap back at the Murdoch media, and people are feeling like a lot of knowledge and culture is like splintered, and there's a lot of like tension, like cultural tension, especially after the sort of COVID lockdown. I feel like we're in a bit of a COVID hangover, like we've had restrictions ease. Like if you're not living in Adelaide right now, things are on the east coast of Australia, like things are kind of relaxed, and Melbourne's and Victoria getting to rejoin the rest of the country a little bit. But we're in this weird kind of like sighing exhale of the weird year, and we're wrapping up the year in a weird way. But people are throwing these terms around. We've had the American elections. People are very passionate about that, myself included. But people are like we don't really know enough about real revolution, real suppression, real violence, real civil
people
war.
are throwing around words like
Right.
revolution. They're throwing around words like we've got to throw out the system and start from scratch.
Yeah.
And you go, how's that going to happen?
My social media post got deleted. Like, no, my family was imprisoned and some of them are missing. I mean, there's a big difference, right?
That's right, exactly. But it's a very interesting time right now because things have been a total mess. America is still
Like
a
leadership
total
failure,
mess.
right?
Australia is quite a big mess as well.
But it's under the radar mess in Australia, don't you reckon? Or do you think it's not so under the radar? I mean, it depends who you
It is
hang out
under
with.
the radar partly because there's a hell of a lot of stuff going on. I think there was something I mentioned to you today and you had not heard about
That's
it. And
it,
it's quite
yeah.
a major thing, like things that the government's doing under cover of, the COVID pandemic, like what they're doing with money.
What was that? That was the legislation.
Well, it's a kind of a COVID support, financial support.
For super rich people to reno their houses.
Exactly. $150,000 you have to spend on a renovation in order to get a government grant of $20,000. So that's an immediate gift to rich people who have $150,000 to use on housing renovations. It's like there's so much going on that nobody can keep up with it all. As I said to you, I feel like, well, the current government is closely aligned and funded by the fossil fuel industry. That means that our government
They're going to have gas-led recovery, aren't they?
way behind, gas-led recovery, all this stuff going on. And, I mean, there's people fighting this all the time. As you know, the Greens are fighting it. There's some Labor politicians that are fighting some of this. That the way that I feel is that, the fossil fuel industry and their friends are just throwing everything at humanity to get away with as much
shock
corruption, as much ripping off everything they can find,
run off with everything,
environmental protections, and getting as much money as they possibly can before they get shut down because, economically speaking, coal is on the way out.
And where do you stand? One thing I learned off, I had this friend that I did eventually have to block. Because it was like, he is not an ally, he is just a shit picker. But he did draw my attention to the omnibus bill in Victoria, which was expanding police search and seizure and detainment and stuff. And, there's this kind of swell of libertarian right, but they would cast themselves as moderate centre. But they're like, no, we have to stop Dictator Dan sort of taking over our personal lives and encroaching on our rights and stuff. And this is all around people being upset at having to wear masks, being upset at having their liberties restricted for public health reasons, not quite in the COVID denial space, but certainly in the, no, let's have a rational conversation about how many old people we're prepared to accept dying, that kind of space, not full denialism. And I found, I was like, well, the omnibus bill, I haven't read about it and stuff, and I want to find out more and stuff. And I checked out a couple of sources, and then I was like, oh, this is a real issue, but these guys are acting like we're in this eureka stockade moment, and we are not. Dictator Dan's not running off with our liberties and stuff. It's not happening like that. It's not true. And I was like, these guys, I've got a feeling these guys are trying to rope us in emotionally on masks and assembling in public spaces without masks, and use that to leverage us to basically reduce taxes on our investments and decrease taxes that we pay when we pass inheritance on and things like that. And it's really a false flag, kind of false rights issue. It's really going to be about protecting the wealthy. And I haven't seen these people muster themselves when the rights of Indigenous people have been shat on all, since forever, since my whole life. And or asylum seekers who are still mandatory detained, or we've got just in Bell Street in Preston here in Melbourne, there's Mantra Hotel where they're detaining a bunch of people. Some of those people have been in detention for 6 or 7 years. So I didn't see them making a big deal then. But now that people are getting very upset because of a mask and they can't see someone's face and they can't see the lips moving and they're very upset, now's the time to seize and recruit for this sort of libertarian mission. I'm like, where were you when all these other people were? Have you seen, is that part that fit in with the shock doctrine stuff, trying to seize on people's emotions at what we can agree has been a hard year?
Well, libertarians are political machines as well. Like they come from a political machine, and where is that connected to? So a lot of the libertarian
Right-wing think tanks
type
and stuff,
of videos and things like that, this is the main way that they promote their ideas is through Facebook videos and stuff. And when you actually look closely at those videos, you see connections with right-wing organizations. But if you don't look closely, I mean, I've even made that mistake myself. You know, I saw something that looked really logical and correct, and I didn't see anything wrong with it. And I sent it to some Facebook page, and they wrote back to me and said, no, we can't print that. That comes from a right-wing source. And I went, right, I'm really sorry. I didn't notice that. So even watching that video did not indicate to me anything sus.
Right,
but the source was Breitbart or some far right, you know, because like they use the truth to get you in, and then you start sharing their posts, and then the whole ball starts rolling in terms of the Facebook, you know, echo chambers and, you know, algorithms and all that sort of stuff. So they do anything to get them. They use the truth sometimes to get you into a little, you know, like Facebook, you know, rhythm. And then a lot of the videos that I've seen, like conspiracy theory videos and stuff like that, a lot of it's libertarian, and a lot of it has direct references to the Republican Party or comes from a Republican source and says things that are pro-Trump. Yeah. And there's a lot of American influence coming across from America to here to promote libertarian and far right-wing ideas. And then when you dig deeper, some of these people that have gone right down that rabbit hole, they end up being anti-Semitic and sort of neo-Nazi.
Well, we've
Even
had
average Australians you wouldn't expect, and they've just been dragged in there.
even average cooking competition TV show hosts have been dragged into,
in there.
and we find this sort of crypto-fascism over Pete Evans. Now, I understand. Now, I've been watching the Byron Bay Community Board where it's lit up because Pete Evans is this like beloved figure, and a lot of people who go in, like they come for the paleo diet tips, but they stay for the crypto-fascist Nazism. This has been like a huge issue. I've really seen the Byron, well, and it depends how authentic we think an online community is for the community itself. But when I was staying up there and getting to know you up in the Shire there for that work project, I was struck by some cultural sensitivities that cut through the perceived unity of like the Byron Shire, which has its distinct feel and so on, that the sort of the left-wing hippie alternative thinking, alternative health kind of ideas, actually, you know, it's almost a bit of like a vote for the horseshoe theory of politics, that actually it's much closer to the sort of dissident right wing of politics and the kind of buried fascism and the kind of disqualified knowledge, which is like an old Foucauldian term from when I used to study at university and teach. So I find that a real curiosity and sort of a shock, if you like.
It is a shock, and that's been happening a lot.
So as you know, Judy, like I'm like, as I've exited the left-wing like professional class or whatever and campaigning class, it's been like a relief for me to embrace a bit more heterodox, like bits and pieces from here and there across the political spectrum, because I think there's a real critique to be had of the left. And the horseshoe theory I don't subscribe to, but the idea that, you know, there are some, you know, like usually when someone's got a right-wing view, I disagree with where they've gone with it, but the thing they're reacting to, I think there's something there. And if we're constantly like, if constantly like on the left fighting the right and so on, we can get so overwhelmed by the front and the battle that we like miss the self-critique that we could improve ourselves along the way, and we become blind. We develop our own blind spots and stuff. So what do you think of that in terms of those like maybe argumentative divides or different, you know, different very emotional, deep disturbances that people have had over COVID and liberty and freedom and markets and gas-led recoveries and all this like this full drama that we've had this year? What do you make of all that?
It's been really in our faces in Byron, because it's a really funny situation. For me, coming from Sydney, I come from a very political environment, so I know what the words left-wing and right-wing mean to some extent. And to me, far right straight up means racism, because it's part of it. If you go to the extreme far right, racism is definitely part of it, and militarism. That's where fascism and Nazism started.
Division and domination.
It started with those principles. They were very pro-war, the original fascists, and then Nazism came in with the same thing. And
irrational nationalism and
Correct.
intensity, like
Nationalism.
violent intensity. Yeah.
Well, they actually thought that war was a great way for humanity to progress.
Jesus.
This is where fascism started. So you'll find that people on the far right, on the whole, are extremely racist and violent. Believe in violence is okay, and war. Not always, but definitely racism is a major part of far right politics, always in my experience. But the very funny and sad thing is when you're sitting in Byron Bay and you have these sort of very clear concepts about what left and right mean, and then you have friends, I mean, it's the biggest hippie capital town or whatever you want to call it in the world, one of them, definitely in Australia. So hippie ideas are very much back to nature, but some of it tends to go
and alternative knowledge. So mainstream has discredited some stuff, but it could be alive and well in the Shire, where it's like, hey, just because the mainstream discredited it, we've got people who believe this stuff and we share this knowledge.
Which stuff are you talking about?
Well, we could go chemtrails, anti-vaccinations, 5G networks.
Lots of things like that,
I mean, as well as like alternative health, like, you know, and it starts to get less crazy and people draw their own boundary and we all think the stuff we believe is fine and then the stuff that's beyond the pale is out of control. But I've got some conspiracy beliefs and
so do I.
Right.
But I was just about to talk about the libertarian thing. So when hippie concepts get taken to a far extreme, sometimes they end up with sovereignty and libertarianism. And sometimes those people don't actually understand what that means in reality because it's more like an idea. Because they're talking about ideas, they're not living in a libertarian society. So they think it sounds wonderful. But, you know, when you get down to the grassroots, it's not.
Well, my
you
critique
need society that, you know, supports and protects the citizens, and those ideas do not. It's just like they love ideas and they love these sort of concepts, but sometimes it's not very practical.
And it's very idealistic, isn't it? It's like this perfect world of like, once I was in like a reading group at uni and I got accused of being someone who just wants to sit on my porch with a gun loaded, you know, and this libertarian ideal, and I can see where they're coming from, but no, you need my critique of libertarianism, why I reject it, is it's like it valorizes the individual and it ignores, you know, I'm very critical of Barack Obama, but I love his "you didn't build that" speech, which was all these self-made people and businesses and the heroism that goes along with that. You know, the roads that got them to school and the bike lanes and the jobs and the support programs and the food pricing and the financial stuff.
When I'm in discussion with people, a lot of the time they don't actually know what's the difference between right and left wing. They don't know what these terms mean. So what I'm discovering is a lack of education. Yeah. That's really important.
It's my vote, it's justice, it's law.
So we've just gravitated outside just to finish this interview off, and there's so many places this conversation could go, but I think you wanted to just make like a point about have like a grounding in where to place these concepts where we can start to frame what people are telling us and where we're weighing it up for ourselves.
Well, I've just been really surprised because sometimes, you know, you're just chatting with friends or you notice on your... When I'm talking about friends, I'm talking about my very, very closest friends coming out with something like anti-masking or coming out with really right-wing stuff on their Facebook pages, and they don't actually know or understand how to analyze it at all. They're just responding to it emotionally, and then they're swallowing everything they see, and it can be a very, you know, right-wing politician who's sort of like starting to hide the fact that he's right-wing and saying, oh, I'm not right-wing, go ahead and prove it.
We've got Matthias Cormann going on about his green recovery
or
green...
all this appropriation of green politics, and it's a lot of lying going on.
Burying his decades of denialism.
Burying, you know, the facts of who they really are. And people swallowing it because they don't actually know how to analyse. They haven't been taught or they just haven't been exposed to concepts like what is the word left-wing mean, what does the word right-wing mean, a bunch of other stuff. I have actually been asked directly by a flatmate, tell me what's the difference between right and left-wing. So you, as you know, inner city Melbourne person, you have really clear concepts of what these things are. A lot of people out there in Australia land don't. They haven't had that education, they haven't been brought up in that environment. They can't really help that because, I mean, I seriously, looking at what I've been through in these last few months, I really feel like the education system is letting people down. And it sounds cliche to say that, but how come people can grow up thinking that some Liberal Party politician started Medicare? You know?
Yes.
and things like that.
And that's what some
That's
people
what people
that you
saying
live with
to me
have said to you, right?
have said to me
Yes.
right in my own house.
Thank God Howard was there.
Stop.
So he wasn't trying to shut it down at every moment of his every waking breath.
We live in a situation, maybe you and I, where we grew up in situations or came to university or did something to learn something about how politics operates in this country, or maybe been, like myself, alive long enough and have a very long memory to understand who did what when. And a lot of people don't. They weren't interested enough to find out, or they just didn't read or watch, Sydney Morning Herald or whatever newspaper that might have a little bit of inkling of what was actually going on in this country. A lot of people had no idea.
It's almost a bit of an Australian generalisable trait to be proud to not be curious of history. I mean, we have to repress the fact of colonial violence and the incursion of even being here, right? So ignorance and sort of willful oppression of information and facts.
Repression of our whole background is all
function.
just hidden on a daily basis. But
how do you go run your small business if you're going to think about reconciliation, or maybe we shouldn't be here every day? Like, it's impossible.
How do you buy a house when you know that it's stolen land?
Yeah.
I had that conversation with a friend last week.
Did you?
They don't feel comfortable to buy a house because they know it's on stolen land. That's a man of principle, and he's quite confused about that issue.
That's how I start my comedy gigs.
Really?
I say, people feeling anxious, people feeling okay, any millennials here worrying about the housing bubble, don't worry, it's all stolen land anyway. Like, if someone, like a guy, a van rolled up to me in the Camberwell market when I was a young man and tried to sell me a TV out the side door, and I said no, but I never regretted not buying the stolen TV. You know what I mean? I never thought, I missed an opportunity there. So if you're out there and you haven't got land, don't even sweat it.
But anyway, it's just been a big shock to me because there's certain things that I just, find really easy to understand. But if you haven't been brought up with any sort of political knowledge or education whatsoever, and you, for example, may not even vote because you think it's, buying into the system, or, you basically have no idea how Australian politics operates. And then you're faced with all this manipulative, brainwashing sort of videos and things like that, and you just start believing everything you see because you think that everybody's as honest as you are. And you don't realise that there's some very dishonest people out there that are setting their mind on manipulating you.
They know better, but they are in it to do well themselves, right? Do well for them and their little...
Well, what motivates the right wing? Number one, there's a lot of right wing politicians that are in cahoots with the corporates. They are, invested in coal, in petrol, oil, and all that sort of thing. So there is an aspect of some of them wanting to exploit people's ignorance to make money. That's going on a lot.
I see that existing on the liberal sort of quote-unquote centre and the progressive left, of creating champions and lions out of people who are simply just getting rich off branding themselves with like progressive concerns. So,
really?
And some of those solutions do involve like hooking up capitalism to have market mechanisms to stop destroying our planet and things like that. So the aims might be very noble and bold, but this is what makes me a bit heterodox since I got out of this like professional campaigner game, is to see how, there's some like a bit of material critique of where the money's moving to and stuff. Like, I don't see much changing in these progressive debates largely, but what I do see is like a bit of wealth transference, if you like. So I'm not totally skeptical about it, but I want to like call it as it is, and making money off a brand and an agreed set of like values that you kind of put out there into the public sphere. Like, the right wing don't have a monopoly on that, but because they've got billions of dollars in interest behind them of corporations and banks and international agreements and things, the power is, the leverage is so much greater. But actually, I see it on the left as well. But if I worked for a progressive professional organisation, couldn't say it. What do you think of that? Is that just spoil your brain, or you're not interested, or it's offensive? What do you think?
I think that you have got a very highly developed ability to critique things. And I think that's good. I don't think many people are doing it, but I think it's a good idea.
Some people just say I'm an arsehole.
No, I think it's a good idea to always be looking deeper into every issue and what people are getting out of it. But ultimately, when you go right down to it, we have to save the planet from climate change. So basically, I'm happy if people are doing that. Simple as that.
Yes. And I think I've seen that. like the climate change response, and it's helped some people get wealthy and develop some stuff, and we develop some technology, and I think that's very important. But I actually see the Indigenous land sovereignty issue that's overtaken for me and become more of a thing, and I've started to see sort of white progressive Australia from the point of view of listening to Indigenous betters
I think
who
that's
show me how we look, and we don't look great, and there's a reason why the Green Base in Australia is like super awkwardly white. It's a real problem, and there's lots of paths and opportunity for it to change. But I kind of feel like some of these things, and it's not the main thing. Like the main thing is like the damage and disturbance of like Nazism and racism coming back is a bigger problem. But also we can't find solutions till we name problems as well. So
I'd like to say something about that, and I'd like to
Please.
say, great. I'm really happy that you brought up the issue of listening to Indigenous voices, because part of the whole world solution to saving the planet from climate change is listening to Indigenous voices, because they have the answers. And I will say that the world and the ideas of the world and the knowledge of the world is like a big jigsaw puzzle, and the Indigenous voices actually hold a lot of the pieces, because the Indigenous voices hold the knowledge, the deep spiritual, physical, emotional knowledge and mental knowledge of how to live in harmony with the planet. And it's
which we have clearly lost that.
Very deep. Like Indigenous people in many places, not every single person of Indigenous background, but in many places, maintain so much knowledge. The amount of knowledge that is held is absolutely unknown to white people in general.
But then, like,
they don't even have an inkling of how much knowledge there is, especially spiritual knowledge.
Yeah.
It's massive and it's very deep.
But then and that's the good thing about the fact that, say, in a place like Byron Bay or the Byron Shire, you can have like disqualified knowledges given a hearing and an airing, and that people are open to hearing disqualified knowledge, because I feel like Indigenous knowledge is disqualified knowledge, and to have generation upon generation be told that your knowledge, whether spiritual or land-based or anything like that, not that you can break it up, has no value. Sorry, it doesn't function in the market, so it can fuck off. Like, that is like super damaging in a way I can't imagine. But so we've got to kind of, even if it means having awkward conversations about vaccination, it's got to be, I think, celebrated and encouraged when there are chances to sort of resurrect and take other looks at disqualified knowledge, even if when it came down to brass tacks, I might say, well, good on you, friend. I don't agree on that one. Do you know what I mean? But the general idea of being open to disqualified knowledges, I feel like lockdown has there's been a very Melbourne version of that with all the masks and the terrible COVID stuff, and in the Byron Shire with whether it's Pete Evans or the little lurking fascism going on there or whatever it is. What do you make of that?
Basically the conspiracy theories, because they're very attractive to people who have alternative ways of living.
Right.
So then they just get roped in.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they're really fascists, but it's just they get tricked. It's actually trickery going on, so I don't really blame them.
Came for the paleo, stayed for the...
That's it. But I'm just going to go back
right-wing.
to Indigenous voices, because what I'm getting at is I'd just like to mention something I learnt from an Aboriginal young man who is a spokesman for their culture. And one day he just told me about the different value system, which I had no knowledge about at my age after living all these decades in Australia. And he's a young man of 21 years old, and he's very vocal, and he's a musician, and he shares culture a lot. And he's now being trained as a songman for his tribe. So they're still very much in connection with their original practices and beliefs.
Right.
Some people are and some people aren't. But he explained to me how different our values are. So white values is basically a lot around materialism and money and stuff like that. That's why we're having a trouble about our trees getting cut down, and our earth being destroyed by money interests. And then he said, we have a totally different value system. And I said, okay, well, what is it? And I had no idea. And he said, what we most highly value is knowledge. And I was like, oh, this is so interesting. He taught me something in like a few sentences, and I said, oh, what's all that about? And he goes, Well, it's about knowledge and being initiated and being trained in spiritual
And
knowledge.
earning knowledge and going through rites.
Well, a lot of it is to do with spirituality, because in our culture, spirituality almost doesn't exist. So it's being destroyed by science and, overrun
But even
by science.
scientific knowledge has been completely attacked and destroyed, even within our culture that created where that science comes from.
To some
Just
extent.
rank power abuse, right?
Yeah, to some extent, of course, with the climate
with climate change,
denialism and all that. But I'm getting at something deeper in that when you talk with Indigenous people, spirituality is something they feel physically and experience and learn and teach, just as same as breathing,
Right.
eating. This
In
is
everything.
a normal part
imminent.
of life. That's why they see nature and ourselves as one, and they see the spirit in everything. We have a spirit inside of us. Well, why would we think that same spirit didn't exist in your cat or your tree?
Yes.
So they see that and they feel that and they know that to be true. So therefore they are the number one guardians of the planet, because they have that deep spiritual connection and
continuity.
belief and knowledge that it's true and real, and they experience ritual and they experience spirituality as something very powerful, which it is. And we are the babies. We are the ignorant children, and they are the grandparents, and they are here to teach us. So that's a whole switching around of the whole perspective of our lives, that the Indigenous people need to become our teachers, our leaders, and we need to bow down to our grandparents and accept that they know more than we do.
Yes.
Massively.
Yes. I agree. Represent.
Thank
Judy
you.
Shelley. I love it.
Thank you
I love
so
it.
much for mentioning about
So good.
Indigenous voices, because it's something that I have been becoming more and more aware of, and Indigenous voices are becoming louder and louder in my ears, and all the prophecies of all the tribes across the planet prophesying this time and calling for the Rainbow Tribe to come forward and save the planet. This is a Hopi Indian prophecy that is now coming true. So part of that has always been the unification of all cultures, all Indigenous people, all voices of all cultures sharing and learning from each other and bringing together the parts of the jigsaw puzzle that have to show us the answers and teach us the answers.
And if the CSIRO still had funding, this stuff wouldn't be on the agenda.
It could be, though.
So there's something about, like nurturing and nourishing opportunities to take another look at knowledges that have been disqualified or minimised or muted through like a pretty unjust sort of development of very industrial, technical, Western, pseudo-rational thinking to sort of dominate the modern world, right?
Now is the time for the flowering. Now is the time. Now is the time, now's the opportunity, because everybody's been shaken up, and this is like when we're talking about Byron Bay, we see the bad side, we see the good side, we see the karma, we see the flow. So the flow into the future, right now we have the choice. We either get stuck in the past, stuck in the Industrial Revolution, which should be over by now, and pass through into a more natural return to nature type of world. Like in Byron Bay, a lot of people are physically returning to live off-grid, physically returning to live on the land, in the forest, connecting every day to nature. That's part of the beauty of that lifestyle. And also listening to Indigenous voices. And Indigenous voices are getting louder if you stop to listen. In Australia, in other countries, and you and I can be part of that by bringing those voices to the wider community, well, whatever ways we can, and to also speak to how important those voices are.
I try to do that by just starting off being humble about whatever it is that I know or think I know. I was at a fantastic conference with some amazing First Nations cultural leaders at the start of the year, and they're just sort of a couple of guys just had a view of we look at how sick and unhappy you guys are, and in the Guardian you can read all these articles about moralizing about close the gap problems that are very real in themselves, but these guys were sort of showing me that they're just sort of looking at colonized white society and all the deep repression that we try to function with every day, and the lack of happiness and the lack of connection, and they just feel sort of sorry for us, and they can't tell the well-meaning progressives from the rapacious right-wing capital accumulators. They can't tell the fucking difference. And
some people can. Some people can.
And again, on either side, I don't know if that's objectively right, but I understand why that's not clear. Do you know what I mean? It's the and so for me, I just try to bring that humility, and I sort of rather ask questions and tell people what's going on.
Well, I agree, and I really love that you mentioned the word humility and to be humble, because I can tell you something. When something like COVID happens and it's very scary, and you think, oh, the whole society can just fall to pieces if this suddenly starts like causing massive breakdown of structures and a lack of availability of supermarket products and all sorts of stuff. For me, living on the land, all of a sudden you are totally humbled by the fact that you don't know how to make fire. You don't know how to grow food enough to live on.
I don't know how my toaster works.
You don't know how to hunt. If you are a meat eater, you don't know how to catch an animal and prepare it to eat. You do not know how to survive in nature.
There's a basic alienation from ourselves.
It's all gone. All the knowledge is gone. Originally, we started out with all that knowledge, and then it was taken away by the Industrial Revolution. But Indigenous people, say, for example, in the Solomon Islands, it's 80% subsistence farmers who live on their land, grow their food, catch their fish. They live without electricity. They live without cars. They live without petrol. They just live on the land all the time. 80% of that country. And so I just feel humbled when I realise that, when you're sitting faced with a major pandemic, faced with the possibility you may not have food to eat if all the supermarkets suddenly close, how you will survive and what happens.
This is the emotional basis of the hardship of this year. It's been a bit of a
how do
wake-up
you
call.
survive
It's a bit
when
of a
climate change destroys everything we know? How are you going to go back to nature? You don't have the knowledge. You're going to have to find an Indigenous person to help you survive.
We've had a theme in the Lever this year about unmasking and mask slipping. So the preferred narrative not being possible with that mask slipping and some of the stark realities of how we live being showed to us through this public health crisis and hardship.
Yeah,
and I think we'll learn some things, possibly learn the wrong things out of it. I mean, I think it sucks that, say, if we, a bunch of well-meaning, white post-colonial Australians try to, appreciate what's happening in the Solomon Islands, the community that you spoke of, they'll just do some kind of noble, savage mythologizing and still not really get to the truth of it. So there's always these opportunities to step wrong. And again, that's just where I come back to the humble, the humility as a sort of a driving
I'll tell
force
you
of
what,
knowledge.
you put any white person out in the bush or out on some island somewhere, it's sort of like,
We'll just Burke and Wills it.
Well,
Fuck it up.
Well, you're going to be looking at some movie called Survival with people who are sort of starving to death. Yeah. And then you go and you live with Indigenous people who are living like that all the time, and they're just so healthy and happy because they are so more knowledgeable than we are about what's real when it comes down to brass tacks. Mm-hmm. What are you going to do? What are you going to do when, there's no supermarket to buy food from or whatever, if there's no petrol to drive? Yeah, that's the sort of thoughts that went through my mind at the beginning of COVID because I didn't know what was going to happen. Look what happened in Italy. All of a sudden I was, starting to get a bit afraid that, we're going to lockdown. Even to get food is quite difficult. Things start running out in the supermarket. Whatever happens, disasters can happen that leave you isolated, especially when you live in the country, especially when you live up there. You can be flooded in. You can be, on the situation where fire, you're isolated by fire. That's the number one thing that Australians need to realise. You are living on a very fragile place, Australia. Climate change denial is ridiculous. It's still going on. Last week, a friend of mine who has a friend who's a meteorologist said they're not going to have children because in 50 years' time, Australia will not be inhabitable. So this is the sort of stuff scientists are saying. This is the sort of stuff we are ignoring every single day. If we do not take action now to fight climate change. Indigenous people know how to do that because they just live lightly and simply on the land. And part of the beauty of the Byron Bay life is a lot of people are doing that too. White people learning how to go back, grow their own food, raise their chickens, eat them, eat their eggs. And that is actually something that we up there realise is something everybody actually needs to get in touch with.
But we don't want meat.
The reality.
We don't want the meat we eat to actually look like the animals that we love so dearly, do we, Judy?
There's people up there that will not actually eat anything they didn't grow themselves because they don't want to see that separation between the reality of the fact you're eating an animal. Yeah. And if you grow your own animal, you love it and you care for it, one day it will pass away. So Some people think that's okay, but there's a lot of extreme vegans who will not touch any animal product as well. And they are actually perhaps people that will help save the planet because, as we know, meat agriculture is a big climate change problem.
Yeah, but also there's a critique of white veganism too, about that sort of attacks meat, like sustainable meat eating practices of First Nations people or of other cultures and multicultural.
Yeah,
it gets thorny and difficult.
It shouldn't do that because basically a lot of really more open-minded vegans say just do what you can. They don't expect everybody to give up meat. A real vegan that really understands about animals and humans will actually step back and say, we just want you to do the best you can.
Yeah, there's a couple of really high-profile like vegan TikTokers who do some real like getting in people's faces and stuff. And I think like what I've seen mainly from myself is if I'm around a vegan friend, I immediately project my own self-loathing onto them that they must be judging me. And I've seen other people do it where the vegetarian or vegan person has not a bad word to say, not a bad look, not a passive-aggressive movement of their body. Not an arch of their eyebrow.
That's right.
And yet the meat eater will like suddenly feel like this intense critique that is really like they're having a conversation with themselves in that moment, and I've felt that myself as well. I've been vegetarian at times and eaten meat a lot of the time, and so like I'm not just a bike rider, I'm also a driver who struggles to get around bikes, and life's very complex, but we can't actually solve these things staying divided and drawing harsh barriers. And this is a bit where my heterodox approach comes as well, because essentially at the end of the day we are all in it together, and every zombie movie I've ever seen involves people with radical different ideas and mutually exclusive offensive ideas between the group having to get together and like survive.
Well, that's right. It's another thing that you realise when you live in a small community and you can get cut off by natural disasters. All of a sudden you are relying on your neighbours, straight up. And what their politics are doesn't come into it anymore. We are together. We're one community. We live next door to each other. If somebody's in trouble, we have to help. We are a community. What does it mean? Like, we are people together.
Does this mean that, like, after we punch that Nazi, we need to make sure we bring a cold compress? Like, I don't know what that says. I haven't got a theory about this, but I'm asking the question.
I am actually against violence, so I wouldn't be punching anybody. So that's my answer.
What a segue that could be. But I might just say thank you so much for sharing all your amazing ideas. And this sort of almost turned into something that could go on Multicultural Nation. I didn't know that at the start, but just what's on both our minds. That's what I love about podcasting, is that conversations go in directions that I could never plan. Like, we had a bit of a brief chat. This all kind of fits in, but we've actually managed to grow onto what we talked about, haven't we?
I'll be very happy if you want to share it with Multicultural Nation Radio Show. Let's do that.
Amazing. It'll be just like it was 2017 and I was up there getting my squeaky voice up on the Byron Bay community station there. All right. Thank you so much, Judy. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience? Are there any resources that people who are interested in stuff can go check out that you'd like to sort of put out there?
The only thing I can think of really is to check out our Facebook page, Multicultural Nation, the FM 99.9. We have a Facebook page, so I put a lot of interesting stuff on there. Some of it goes on the show, some of it's just around general ideas that we're trying to get across. And also you can go to bayfm.org, and there you can listen back to all our previous shows. You just click on programs, or you can live stream and listen to any show live via the internet. So that's all I can think of right now.
Right on. Well, also, we'll just, speaking of a good reason to have humble knowledge is that I haven't actually acknowledged that we're doing this on the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. So, always will be Aboriginal land. And whether I insert this at the end, I might not cut this out and chuck it at the front. I might keep it at the back here to do a bit of demonstrated practice. You always want to be humble in your knowledge, because you never know when you're going to realise that you've got an arse cheek hanging out, and I think that's important. But yeah, I just want to, thank you so much for sharing everything with us, and, hati-hati di jalan, teman aku.
Terima kasih, sampai jumpa lagi.
All right, thanks Jude. Take care out there everyone, and we'll continue this conversation in future episodes. Bye-bye.
So now it's time to like and subscribe to the Lever podcast. Go over to YouTube and check for dissatisfunctional.com. Spelt just the way it sounds. This is the perfect time to share the stuff that you like with your friends. So if you've liked the conversation today, then please leave us a review in the Apple Store. I do have a Patreon. You can chuck something in the tip jar for $2 and you'll get special unreleased B-sides, but no one's got a job. How are you going to pay for that? You just have a listen, you enjoy it, and tune in for next time. The intro track you're listening to is by Neil Lawrence, who's done a great remix of the bullshit song I made on GarageBand. So thanks very much, Neil, if you're listening out there. Talented man. And if you're new, go and check out the previous episodes. You'll definitely find something that speaks to you. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. See you again.